8. That to which his fiancée was so indifferent produced on Luzhin an impression nobody could have foreseen. He visited the famous apartment in which the very air seemed colored with phony folklore, immediately after obtaining his first point by defeating an extremely tenacious Hungarian. The game, it is true, had been postponed after 40 moves, but the continuation was perfectly clear to Luzhin. To a faceless taxi driver, he read aloud the address on the postcard. "We've come. Je donne vas vekarom, expecting you this evening," and having imperceptibly surmounted the dim accidental distance, he cautiously tried to pull the ring out of the lion's jaws. The bell leapt into action immediately. The door flew open. "What, no overcoat? I won't let you in." But he had already stepped over the threshold and was waving his arm and shaking his head in an attempt to overcome his shortness of breath. "Foof, foof," he gasped, preparing himself for a wonderful embrace, and then suddenly noticed that his left hand, already extended to one side, held an unnecessary cane, and his right his billfold, which he had evidently been carrying since he paid his taxi fare. "Wearing that black monster of a hat again? Well, why are you standing there? This way." His cane dived safely into a vase-like receptacle. His billfold, at the second thrust, found the right pocket, and his hat was hung on a hook. "Here I am," said Luzhin. "Foof, foof." She was already far away at the end of the entrance hall. She pushed a door sideways, her bare arm extended along the jamb, bending her head and gaily looking up at Luzhin. And over the door, immediately over the lintel, there was a large, vivid oil painting that caught the eye. Luzhin, who normally did not notice such things, gave his attention to it because it was greasily glossed with electric light, and the colors dazed him like a sunstroke. A village girl in a red kerchief coming down to her eyebrows was eating an apple, and her black shadow on a fence was eating a slightly larger apple. "A Russian baba," said Luzhin, with relish, and laughed. "Well, come in, come in. Don't upset that table." He entered the drawing room and went all limp with pleasure, and his stomach, beneath the velvet waistcoat for some reason he always wore during tournaments, quivered touchingly with laughter. A chandelier with pale translucent pendants answered him with an oddly familiar vibration, and on the yellow parquetry that reflected the legs of Empire armchairs, a white bearskin with spread paws lay in front of the piano as if lying in the shiny abyss of the floor. All sorts of festive-looking knickknacks were on numerous small tables, shelves, and consoles, while something resembling big, heavy rubles gleamed silver in a cabinet, and a peacock feather stuck out from behind the frame of a mirror, and there were lots of pictures on the walls. More country girls in flowered kerchiefs, a golden bogatyr on a white draft horse, log cabins beneath blue feather beds of snow. All this for Luzhin merged into an affecting glitter of color, from which a separate object would momentarily leap out, a porcelain moose or a dark-eyed icon, and then again there would be that gay rippling in his eyes, and the polar skin which he had tripped over, causing one edge to reverse, turned out to have a scalloped red lining. It was more than 10 years since he had been in a Russian home, and now, finding himself in a house where a gaudy Russia was boldly put on display, he experienced a childish elation, a desire to clap his hands. Never in his life had he felt so cozy and so at ease. "Left over from Easter," he said with conviction, pointing with his auricular finger at a large gold-patterned wooden egg, a tombola prize from a charity ball. At that moment a white double-leafed door burst open, and a very upright gentleman with his hair en brosse and a pince-nez came swiftly into the room, one hand already stretched out. "Welcome," he said. "Pleased to meet you." Here, like a conjurer, he opened a handmade cigarette case that had an Alexander I eagle on the lid. "With mouthpieces," said Luzhin, squinting at the cigarettes. "I don't smoke that kind, but look." He began to burrow in his pockets, extracting some thick cigarettes that were spilling from a paper pack. He dropped several of them, and the gentleman nimbly picked them up. "My pet," he said, "get us an ashtray. Please take a seat. Excuse me, I don't know your name and patronymic." A crystal ashtray came down between them, and simultaneously dipping their cigarettes, they knocked the ends together. "Jadub," said the chess player, good-naturedly straightening his bent cigarette. Never mind," said the other quickly, and expelled 2 thin streams of smoke through the nostrils of his suddenly narrowed nose. "Well, here you are in our good old Berlin. My daughter tells me you came for a contest." He freed a starched cuff, placed one hand on his hip, and continued, By the way, I've always wondered, is there a move in chess that always enables one to win? I don't know if you understand me, but what I mean is, sorry, your name and patronymic? I understood, said Lucian, conscientiously considering for a moment. You see, we have quiet moves and strong moves. A strong move? Ah, yes, so that's it, nodded the gentleman. A strong move is one that, continued Lucian, loudly and enthusiastically, that immediately gives us an undoubted advantage. A double check, for example, with the taking of a heavyweight piece, or say when a pawn is queened, etc., etc. And a quiet move, I see, said gentleman. About how many days will the contest last? A quiet move implies trickery, subversion, complication, said Lucian, trying to please but also entering into the spirit of things. Let's take some position. White, he pondered, staring at the ashtray. Unfortunately, said his host nervously, I don't understand anything about chess. I only asked you, but that does not matter at all. In a moment, we'll proceed to the dining room. Tell me, my pet, is tea ready? Yes, exclaimed Lucian. We'll simply take the in-game position at the point it was interrupted today. White, king c3, rook l, knight d5, pawns b3 and c4. Black, a complicated thing, chess, interjected the gentleman and jumped buoyantly to his feet, trying to cut off the flood of letters and numbers having some kind of relation to black. Let us suppose now, said Lucian weightily, that black makes the best possible move in this position, e6 to g5. To this I reply with the following quiet move. Lucian narrowed his eyes and almost in a whisper, pursing his lips as for a careful kiss, emitted not words, not the more designation of a move, but something most tender and infinitely fragile. The same expression was on his face, the expression of a person blowing a tiny feather for the face of an infant, when the following day he embodied this move on the board. The Hungarian, sallow-cheeked after a sleepless night, during which he had managed to check all the variations leading to a draw, but had failed to notice just this one hidden combination, sank into deep meditation over the board, while Lucian, with a finicky little cough, lovingly noted his own move on a sheet of paper. The Hungarian soon resigned, and Lucian sat down to play with the Russian. The game began interestingly, but soon a solid ring of spectators had formed around their table. The curiosity, the pressure, the cracking of joints, the alien breathing, and most of all the whispering interrupted by a still louder and more irritating shush, frequently tormented Lucian. He used to be keenly affected by this crackling and rustling, and smelly human warmth if he did not retreat so deeply into the abysses of chess. Out of the corner of his eye he now saw the legs of bystanders, and found particularly irritating, among all those dark trousers, a pair of woman's feet in gleamingly gray stockings and bluish shoes. These feet obviously understood nothing of the game. One wondered why they had come. Those pointed shoes with transverse straps or something would be better clicking along the sidewalk, as far away as possible from here. While stopping his clock, jotting down a move, or putting a captured piece aside, he would glance askance at these motionless feminine feet, and only an hour and a half later, when he had won the game and stood up, tugging his waistcoat down, did Lucian see that these feet belonged to his fiancée. He experienced a keen sense of happiness that she had been there to see him, and he waited avidly for the chessboards and all the noisy people to disappear in order to caress her. But the chessboards did not disappear immediately, and even when the bright dining room appeared together with its huge brassy bright samovar, indistinct regular squares showed through the white tablecloth, and similar squares, chocolate and cream ones, were indubitably there on frosted cake. His fiancée's mother met him with the same condescending, slightly ironic indulgence with which she had greeted him the night before, when her appearance had put an end to the conversation about chess, and the person with whom he had talked, her husband, evidently now started to tell him what a model country estate he had owned in Russia. "Let's go to your room," whispered Lucian hoarsely to his betrothed, and she bit her lip and looked surprised. "Let's go," he repeated, but she adroitly placed some heavenly raspberry jam on his glass plate, and the sticky, dazzlingly red sweetness, which ran over the tongue like granular fire and gummed the teeth with fragrant sugar, took immediate effect. "Merci, merci." Lucian bowed as he was served a second helping, and amid deathly sentence smacked his lips again, licking a spoon that was still hot from the tea, for fear of losing even a single drop of the entrancing syrup. And when finally he got his own way and found himself alone with her, not, it is true, in her room, but in the gaudy drawing room, he drew her to him and sat down heavily, holding her by the wrists, and she silently freed herself, circled, and sat down on a hassock. I have not at all made up my mind whether to marry you, she said. Remember that. Everything's decided, said Luzhin. If they won't let you, we'll use force to make them sign. Sign what? She asked with surprise. I don't know, but it seems we need some kind of signature or other. Stupid, stupid, she repeated several times. Impenetrable and incorrigible in stupidity. What am I to do with you? What course of action shall I take with you? And how tired you look. I'm sure it's bad for you to play so much. Aqua, said Luzhin, a couple of little games. And at night you keep thinking, you mustn't do it. It's already late, you know. Go home. You need sleep, that's what. He remained sitting on the striped sofa, however, and she thought in dismay about the kind of conversations they had, a poke here, a dab there, in disconnected words. And not once, so far, had he kissed her properly. All this was bizarre and distorted, and when he touched her, not a single movement of his resembled a normal human embrace. But that forlorn devotion in his eyes, that mysterious light that had illuminated him when he bent over the chessboard, and the following day she again felt the urge to visit those silent premises on the second floor of a large cafe on a narrow, noisy street. This time Luzhin noticed her at once. He was conversing in low tones with a broad-shouldered, clean-shaven man whose short-cropped hair seemed to have closely fitted to his head and came down onto his forehead in small peak. His thick lips were unfolding and sucking an extinguished cigar. An artist who had been sent by his newspaper, lifting and lowering his face like a brass doll with a movable head, was swiftly sketching the profile with a cigar. Glancing at his pad as she passed, she saw next to this rudimentary Tarati an already completed Luzhin, exaggeratedly doleful nose, dark stippled double chin, and on the temple that familiar lock which she called a curl. Tarati sat down to play with the German grandmaster, and Luzhin came up to her, and gloomily, with a guilty smile, said something long and clumsy. She realized with surprise that he was asking her to leave. I'm very glad, post factum, explained Luzhin pleadingly, but for the moment it somehow disturbs me. He followed her with his eyes as she obediently withdrew between the rows of chess tables, and after nodding briskly to himself, he made his way to the board where his new opponent was already seating himself, a grizzled Englishman who played with invariable sang-froid and invariably lost. Neither was he lucky this time, and Luzhin again won a point, and the next day he achieved a draw and then again won, and by that time he no longer felt distinctly the boundary between chess and his fiancée's home, as if movement had been speeded up, and what at first seemed an alternation of strips was now a flicker. He moved in step with Tarati. Tarati scored a point, and he scored a point. Tarati scored a half, and he scored a half. Thus they proceeded with their separate games, as if mounting the sides of an isosceles triangle, the destined and the decisive moment to meet at the apex. The nights were somehow bumpy. He just could not manage to force himself not to think of chess, and although he felt drowsy, sleep could find no way into his brain. It searched for a loophole, but every entrance was guarded by a chess sentry, and he had the agonizing feeling that sleep was just there, close by, but on the outside of his brain. The Luzhin, who was wearily scattered down around the room, slumbered, but the Luzhin who visualized the chessboard stayed awake and was unable to merge with his happy double. Still worse, after every session of tournament, it was with greater difficulty that he crawled out of the world of chess concepts, so that an unpleasant split began to appear even in daytime. After a 3-hour game in his head ached strangely, not all of it, but in parts, black squares of pain, and for a while he could not find the door, which was obscured by a black spot, nor could he remember the address of the cherished house. Luckily, his pocket still preserved that old postcard, folded in two and already tearing along the crease. Was Vacherom, expecting you this evening. He still continued to feel joy when he entered this house filled with Russian toys, but the joy too was spotty. Once, on a day with no play, he came earlier than usual when only the mother was at home. She decided to continue the conversation that had taken place at sunset on the beach coppice, and overestimating her own highly prized ability to speak her mind, for which the young men who visited their house considered her tremendously intelligent and were very much afraid of her, she swooped on Luzhin, lecturing him first of all on the cigarette butts found in all the vases, and even in the jaws of the spread eagle bear, and then suggested there and then, this Saturday evening, he take a bath at their place after her husband had finished his own weekly ablutions. I dare say you don't wash often, she said without circumlocution. Not too often? Admit it now. Luzhin gloomily shrugged his shoulders, looking at the floor, where a slight movement was taking place, perceptible to him alone, an evil differentiation of shadows. And in general, she continued, you must pull yourself together, and having thus put her hearer in the right mood, she went on to the main subject. Tell me, she asked, I imagine you managed to debauch my little girl thoroughly? People like you are great lechers. But my daughter is chaste, not like today's girls. Tell me, you're a lecher, aren't you? No, madame, he replied, Luzhin with a sigh, and he frowned and quickly drew the sole of his shoe over the floor, obliterating a certain grouping that was already quite distinct. Why, I don't know you at all, continued the swift, sonorous voice. I shall have to make inquiries about you. Yes, inquiries, to see if you haven't one of those special diseases. Shortness of breath, said Luzhin, and also a bit of rheumatism. I'm not talking about that, she interrupted crossly. It's a serious matter. You evidently consider yourself engaged. You come here and spend time alone with her, but I don't think there can be any talk of marriage for a while. And last year I had the piles, said Luzhin dully. Listen, I'm talking to you about extremely important things. You would probably like to get married today, right away, I know you. Then she'll be going about with a big belly and you'll brutalize her immediately. Having stamped out a shadow in one place, Luzhin saw with despair that far from where he was sitting a new combination was taking shape on the floor. If you are the least interested in my opinion, then I must tell you I consider this match ridiculous. You probably think my husband will support you. Admit it, you do think that. I am in straitened circumstances, said Luzhin. I would need very little, and a magazine has offered me to edit its chess section. Here the nuisances on the floor became so brazen that Luzhin involuntarily put out a hand to remove shadows from the threat of light's pawn. From that day on he avoided sitting in that drawing-room, where there were too many knick-knacks of polished wood that assumed very definite features if you looked at them long enough. His fiancée noticed that with each day of the tournament he looked worse and worse. His eyes were ringed with dull violet, and his heavy lids were inflamed. He was so pale that he always seemed ill-shaven, although on his fiancée's insistence he shaved every morning. She awaited the end of the tournament with great impatience, and it pained her to think what fabulous harmful exertions he had to make to gain each point. Poor Luzhin, mysterious Luzhin, all through those autumn days while playing tennis in the mornings with a German girlfriend, or listening to lectures on art that had long since palled on her, or leafing through a tattered assortment of books in her room, Andreev's The Ocean, a novel by Krasnov, and a pamphlet entitled How to Become a Yogi, she was conscious that right now Luzhin was immersed in chess calculations, struggling and suffering, and it vexed her that she was unable to share it in the torments of his art. She believed in his genius unconditionally, and was convinced, moreover, that this genius could not be exhausted by the mere playing of chess, however wonderful it might be, and that when the tournament fever had passed and Luzhin had calmed down, he would rest, and within him some kind of still unfathomed forces would come into play, and he would blossom out and display his gift in other spheres of life as well. Her father called Luzhin a narrow fanatic, but added that he was undoubtedly a very naive and very respectable person. Her mother, on the other hand, maintained that Luzhin was going out of his mind not by the day but by the hour, and that lunatics were forbidden by law to marry, and she concealed the inconceivable fiancé from all her friends, which was easy at first. The thought was that she at the resort with her daughter, but then very soon there reappeared all those people who usually frequented their house, such as a charming old general, who always maintained that it was not Russia we expatriates regretted, but youth. Youth, a couple of Russian Germans, Oleg Sergeyevich Smirnovsky, the office and proprietor of a liquor factory, several former officers of the White Army, several young ladies, the singer Madame Vozdevsky, and the Alfurov couple, and also the aged Princess Umanov, whom they called the Queen of Spades after the well-known opera. She was who was the first to see Luzhin, concluding from a hasty and unintelligible explanation by the mistress of the house that he had some kind of connection with literature and magazines, was in a word an author. And that thing, do you know it? She asked politely, striking up a literary conversation. From Apukhin, one of the new poets, slightly decadent, something about yellow and red cornflowers. Smirnovsky lost no time in asking him for a game of chess, but unfortunately there proved to be no set in the house. The young people among themselves called him a ninny, and only the old general treated him with the most cordial simplicity, exhorting him at length to go see the little giraffe that had just been born at the zoo. Once the visitors began to come, appearing every evening, now in various combinations, Luzhin was unable to be alone with his fiancée for a single moment, and in struggle with them, his efforts to penetrate through the thick of them to her immediately took on a tinge of chess. However, it proved impossible to overcome them. More and more of them would appear, and he fancied it was they, the numberless, faceless visitors, who densely and hotly surrounded him during the hours of the tournament. An explanation of all that was happening came one morning when he was sitting on a chair in the middle of his hotel room and trying to concentrate his thoughts on one thing alone. Yesterday he had won his 10th point, and today he had to beat Moser. Suddenly his fiancée entered the room. Just like a little idol, she laughed, sitting in the middle while sacrificial gifts are brought to him. She stretched out a box of chocolates to him, and suddenly the laughter disappeared from her face. "Luzhin," she cried. "Luzhin, wake up. What's the matter with you? Are you real?" asked Luzhin softly and unbelievingly. "Of course I'm real. What a thing to do, putting your chair in the middle of the room and sitting there. If you don't rouse yourself immediately, I'm leaving." Luzhin immediately roused himself, moving his shoulders and head about, then transferred his seat to the couch, and a happiness that was not quite sure of itself, not quite settled, shone and swam in his eyes. "Tell me, when will this end?" she asked. "How many games to go?" "3," replied Luzhin. "I read today in the newspaper that you are bound to win the tournament, and this time you are playing extraordinarily. But there's Tarati," said Luzhin and raised his finger. "I feel sick to my stomach," he added mournfully. "Then no candies for you," she said quickly, and tucked the square package under her arm again. "Luzhin, I'm going to call a doctor. You simply will die if it goes on like this." "No, no," he said sleepily. "It's already past. There's no need for a doctor. It worries me. That means till Friday, till Saturday, this hell. And at home things are pretty grim. Everyone's agreed with Mama that I mustn't marry you. Why were you feeling sick? Have you eaten something or other?" "It's gone completely," muttered Luzhin, and put his head down on her shoulder. "You're simply very tired, poor boy. Are you really going to play today?" "At 3 o'clock, against Moser. In general, I'm playing, how did they put it? Extraordinarily," she smiled. The head lying on her shoulder was large, heavy, a precious apparatus with a complex, mysterious mechanism. A minute later she noticed that he had fallen asleep, and she began to think of how to transfer his head now to some cushion or other. With extreme careful movements she managed to do it. She was now half lying on the couch, uncomfortably doubled up, and the head of the pillow was waxen. For a moment she was seized with horror lest he had died suddenly, and she even felt his wrist, which was soft and warm. When she straightened up she felt a twinge of pain in her shoulder. "A heavy head," she whispered, as she looked at the sleeper, and quietly left the room, taking her unsuccessful present with her. She asked the chambermaid she met in the corridor to wait Luzhin in an hour, and descending the stairs soundlessly she set off through the sunlit streets to the tennis club, and caught herself still trying not to make a noise or any sharp movements. The chambermaid did not have to wake Luzhin. He awoke by himself and immediately made strenuous efforts to recall the delightful dream he dreamed, knowing from experience that if he didn't begin immediately to recall it, later it would be too late. He had dreamed that he was sitting strangely in the middle of the room, and suddenly, with the absurd and blissful suddenness usual in dreams, his fiancée entered, holding out a package tied with red ribbon. She was dressed also in the style of dreams, in a white dress and soundless white shoes. He wanted to embrace her, but suddenly felt sick. His head whirled, and she in the meantime related that the newspapers were writing extraordinary things about him, but that her mother still did not want them to marry. Probably there was much more of this and that, but his memory failed to overtake what was receding, and trying at least not to disperse what he had managed to wrest from his dream, Luzhin stirred cautiously, smoothed down his hair, and rang for dinner to be brought. After dinner he had to play, and that day the universe of chess concepts revealed an awesome power. He played 4 hours without pause and won, and when he was already sitting in the taxi he forgot on the way there that he was going, what postcard address he had given the driver to read, and waited with interest to see where the car would stop. The house, however, he recognized, and again there were guests, but then Luzhin realized that he had simply returned to his recent dream, for his fiancée asked him in a whisper, "Well, how are you? Has the sickness gone?" And how could she have known about this in real life? "We're living in a fine dream," he said to her softly. "Now I understand everything." He looked about him and saw the table and the faces of the people sitting there, the reflection in the samovar, a special Samovarian perspective, and added with tremendous sleep, "So this too isn't a dream? These people are a dream? Well, well. Quiet, quiet. What are you babbling about?" she whispered anxiously, and Luzhin thought she was right. One should not scare off a dream. Let them sit there, these people, for the time being. But the most remarkable thing about this dream was that all around evidently was Russia, which the sleeper himself had left ages ago. The inhabitants of the dream, gay people drinking tea, were conversing in Russian, and the sugar bowl was identical to the one from which he had spooned powdered sugar on the veranda on a scarlet summer evening many years ago. Luzhin noted this return to Russia with interest, with pleasure. It diverted him, especially as the witty repetition of a particular combination which occurs, for example, in a strictly problem idea, long since discovered in theory, is repeated in a striking guise on the board in live play. The whole time, however, now feebly, now sharply, shadows of his real-life chess life would show through his dream, and finally it broke through, and it was simply right in the hotel. Chess thoughts, chess insomnia, and meditations on the drastic defense he had invented to counter Charati's opening. He was wide awake, and his mind worked clearly, purged of all dross, and aware that everything apart from chess was only an enchanting dream, in which, like the golden haze of the moon, the image of a sweet, clear-eyed maiden with bare arms dissolved and melted. The rays of his consciousness, which were wont to disperse when they came into contact with the incompletely intelligible world surrounding him, thereby losing one half of their force, had grown stronger and more concentrated now that this world had dissolved into a mirage, and there was no longer any need to worry about it. Real-life chess life was orderly, clear-clad, and rich in adventure, and Luzhin noted with pride how easy it was for him to reign in this life, and the way everything obeyed his will and bowed to his schemes. Some of the games at Berlin tournament had even been then termed immortal by connoisseurs. He had won one after sacrificing in succession his queen, a rook, and a knight, and another he had placed a pawn in such a dynamic position that it acquired an absolutely monstrous force, and had continued to grow and swell balefully for his opponent like a furnicle in the tenderest part of the board, and finally in a third game, by means of an apparently absurd move that provoked a murmuring among the spectators, Luzhin constructed an elaborate trap for his opponent that the latter divined too late. In these games and in all the others that he played at this unforgettable tournament, he manifested a stunning clarity of thought, a merciless logic, but Tarati also played brilliantly. Tarati also scored point after point, somewhat hypnotizing his opponents with the boldness of his imagination, trusting too much, perhaps, to the chess luck that had never deserted him. His meeting with Luzhin was to decide who would get first prize, and there were those who said the limpidity and lightness of Luzhin's thought would prevail over the Italian's tumultuous fantasy, and there were those who forecast that their fiery, swift-swooping Turati would defeat the far-sighted Russian player, and the day of their meeting arrived. Luzhin awoke fully dressed, even wearing his overcoat. He looked at his watch, rose hastily, put on his hat, which had been lying in the middle of the room. At this point he recollected himself, and looked around the room, trying to understand what exactly he had slept on. His bed was unrumpled, and the velvet of the couch was completely smooth. The only thing he knew for sure was that from time immemorial he had been playing chess, and in the darkness of his memory, as in two mirrors reflecting a candle, there was only the vista of converging lights, which Luzhin sat at a chessboard, and again Luzhin on a chessboard, only smaller, and then smaller still, and so on an infinity of times. But he was late, and he had to hurry. He swiftly opened the door and stopped in bewilderment. According to his concept of things, the chess hall and his table and the waiting Tarati should have been right there. Instead of this, he saw an empty corridor and a staircase beyond it. Suddenly from that direction, the stairs appeared swiftly running little man, who caught sight of Luzhin and spread out his hands. "Maestro," he exclaimed, "what's this? We are waiting for you. They are waiting for you, Maestro. I telephoned you 3 times, and they said you didn't answer their knocks. Signor Tarati has been at this post a long time." "They removed it," said Luzhin sourly, pointing to the empty corridor with his cane. "How was I to know that everything would be removed?" "If you don't feel well," said the little man, looking sadly at Luzhin's pale, glistening face. "Well, take me there," cried Luzhin in a shrill voice, and banged his cane on the floor. With pleasure," muttered the other distractedly. His gaze concentrated on the little overcoat with its raised collar running in front of him, and Luzhin began to conquer the incomprehensible space. "We'll go on foot," said his guide. "It's exactly a minute's walk." With a feeling of relief, Luzhin recognized the revolving doors of the cafe, and then the staircase, and then finally he saw what he had been looking for in the hotel corridor. Upon entering, he immediately felt fullness of life, calm, clarity, and confidence. "There's a big victory coming," he said loudly, and a crowd of dim people parted in order to let him through. "Tard, tes tard," jabbered Tarati, materializing suddenly and shaking his head. "Avanti," said Luzhin, and laughed. A table appeared between them, and upon it was a board with pieces set out ready for the battle. Luzhin took a cigarette from his waistcoat pocket and unconsciously lit it up. At this point a strange thing happened. Tarati, although having wide, did not launch his famous opening, and the defense Luzhin had worked out proved an utter waste. Whether because Tarati anticipated possible complications, or else had simply decided to play warily, knowing the calm strength which Luzhin had revealed at his tournament, he began in the most banal way. Luzhin momentarily regretted the work done in vain, but nevertheless he was glad. This gave him more freedom. Moreover, Tarati was evidently afraid of him. On the other hand, there was undoubtedly some trick concealed in the innocent jejune opening proposed by Tarati, and Luzhin settled down to play with particular care. At first it went softly, like muted violins. The players occupied their positions cautiously, moving this and that up, but doing politely, without the slightest sign of a threat. As if there was any threat, it was entirely conventional, more like a hint to one's opponent that over there he would do well to build a cover, and the opponent would smile as if all this were an insignificant joke and straighten the proper place and himself move forward a fraction. Then, without the least warning, a chord sang out tenderly. This was one of Tarati's forces occupying a diagonal line. But forthwith a trace of melody very softly manifested itself on Lucian's side also. For a moment mysterious possibilities were quivering, and then all was quiet again. Tarati retreated, drew in, and once more for a while both opponents, as if having no intention of advancing, occupied themselves with sprucing up their own squares, nursing, shifting, smoothing things down at home, and then there was another sudden flare-up, a swift combination of sounds. Two small forces collided, and both were immediately swept away. A momentary masterly motion of the fingers, and Lucian removed and placed on the table beside him what was no longer an incorporeal force, but a heavy yellow palm. Tarati's fingers flashed in the air, and an inert black pawn with the gleam of light on its head was in turn lowered onto the table, and having got rid of these two chess quantities that had so suddenly turned into wood, the players seemed to calm down and forget the momentary flare-up. The vibration in this part of the board, however, had not yet quite died down. Something was still endeavoring to take shape. But these sounds did not succeed in establishing the desired relationship. Some other deep, dark note chimed elsewhere, and both players abandoned the still quivering square and became interested in another part of the board. But here, too, everything ended abortively. The weightiest elements of the board called to one another several times with trumpet voices, and again there was an exchange, and again two chess forces were transformed into carved, brightly lacquered dummies. And then there was a long, long interval of thought, during which Lucian bred from one spot to the board, and lost a dozen illusionary games in succession, and then his fingers groped and found a bewitching, brittle, crystalline combination with which a gentle tinkle disintegrated at Tarati's first reply, but neither was Tarati able to do anything after that, and playing for time. Time is merciless in the universe of chess. Both opponents repeated the same two moves, threatened, defense, but meanwhile both kept thinking of a most tricky conceit that had nothing in common with these mechanical moves, and Tarati finally decided on this combination, and immediately a kind of musical tempest overwhelmed the board, and Lucian searched stubbornly in it for the tiny clear note that he needed in order to swell it out into a thunderous harmony. Now everything on the board breathed with life. Everything was concentrated on a single idea and was rolled out tighter and tighter. For a moment the disappearance of two pieces eased the situation. Then again, agitato. Lucian's thought roamed through entrancing terrible labyrinths, meeting there now and then the anxious thought of Tarati, who sought the same thing as he. Both realized simultaneously that White was not destined to develop his scheme any further, that he was on the brink of losing rhythm. Tarati hastened to propose an exchange, and the number of forces on the board was again reduced. No possibilities appeared, but still no one could say which side would the advantage. Lucian prepared an attack for which it was first necessary to explore a maze of variations, whereas every step aroused a perilous echo. He began a long meditation. He needed, it seemed, to make one last prodigious effort, and he would find the secret move leading to victory. Suddenly something occurred outside his being, a scorching pain, and he let out a loud cry, shaking his hand, stung by the flame of a match which he had lit and forgotten to apply to his cigarette. The pain immediately passed, but the fiery gap. He had seen something unbearably awesome, the full horror of the abysmal depths of chess. He glanced at the chessboard, and his brain wilted from hitherto unprecedented weariness. But the chessmen were pitiless. They held and absorbed him. There was a horror in this, but this also is the sole harmony. For what else exists in the world besides chess? Fog, the unknown, the non-being. He knows that Tarati was no longer sitting. He stood stretching himself. Adjournment, maestro, and said a voice from behind. Note your next move. No, not yet, said Lucian pleadingly. His eyes were searching for the person who spoke. That's all for today. The same voice went on, again from behind, a great, gyratory kind of voice. Lucian went up to stand, but was unable to. He saw that he had moved backward somewhere, together with his chair, and that people had hurled themselves rapaciously upon the position of the chessboard, where the whole of his life had just been, and were wrangling around and shouting as they nimbly moved the pieces this way and that. He again tried to stand up and again was unable to. Why, he said plaintively, trying to distinguish the board between the narrow black specks bent over it. They dwindled completely away and disappeared. On the board the pieces were mixed up now and stood about in disorderly groups. A phantom went by, stopped, and began swiftly to stow the pieces away in a tiny coffin. It's over, said Lucian, and groaning from all the effort, wrenched himself out of the chair. A few phantoms still stood about discussing something. It was cold and fairly dark. Phantoms were carrying off all the boards and chairs. Tortuous and transparent chess images roamed about in the air wherever you looked, and Lucian, realizing that he got stuck, that he had lost his way in one of the combinations he had so recently pondered, made a desperate attempt to free himself, to break out somewhere, even if into non-existence. Let's go, cried someone, and disappeared with a bang. he remained alone. His vision became darker and darker, and in relation to every vague object in the hall, he stood in check. He had to escape. He moved, the whole of his fat body shaking. He was completely unable to imagine what people did in order to get out of a room, and yet there should be a simple method. Abruptly, a black shade with a white breast began to hover about him, offering him his coat and hat. "Why is this necessary?" he muttered, getting into the sleeves and revolving together with the obliging ghost. "This way," said the ghost briskly, and Luzhin stepped forward and out of the terrible hall. Catching sight of the stairs, he began to creep upward, then changed his mind and went down, since it was easier to descend than to climb up. He found himself in a smoky establishment where noisy phantoms were sitting. An attack was developing at every corner, and pushing aside tables, a bucket with a gold-necked glass palm sticking out of it, and a drum that was being beaten by an arched, thick-maned chess-knight. He made his way to a gently revolving glass radiance and stopped, not knowing where to go next. People surrounded him and wanted to do something with him. Go away," a gruff voice kept repeating. "But where?" said Luzhin, weeping. "Go home," whispered another voice insinuatingly, and something pushed against Luzhin's shoulder. "What did you say?" he asked again, suddenly ceasing to sob. "Home, home," repeated the voice, and the glass radiance, taking hold of Luzhin, threw him out into the cool dusk. Luzhin smiled. "Home," he said softly. "So that's the key to the combination," and it was necessary to hurry. At any minute these chest growths might ring in him again. For the time being, he was surrounded by twilight-marked, thick cotton wool air. He asked a ghost slipping by how to get to the manor. The ghost did not understand and passed on. "One moment," said Luzhin, but it was already too late. Then, swinging his short arms, he quickened a step. A pale light sailed past and disintegrated with a mournful rustle. It was difficult to find one's way home in this yielding fog. Luzhin felt he should keep left, and then there would be a big wood, and once in the wood he would easily find the path. Another shadow slipped by. "Where's the wood? Where's the wood?" Luzhin asked insistently, and since this wood evoked no reply, he cast around for a synonym. "Forest? Wald?" he muttered. "Park?" he added indulgently. Then the shadow pointed to the left and disappeared from view. Upbraiding himself for his slowness, anticipating pursuit at any minute, Luzhin strode off in the direction indicated, and indeed, he was suddenly surrounded by trees. Ferns crepitated underfoot. It was quiet and damp. He sank down heavily on the ground and squatted there, for he was quite out of breath, and tears poured down his brave face. Presently he got up, removed a wet leaf from his knee, and after wandering among the tree trunks for a short time, he found the familiar footpath. "Marsh, marsh," Luzhin kept repeating, urging himself as he walked over the sticky ground. He had already come halfway. Soon there would be the river, the sawmill, and then the manor house would peep through the bare bushes. He would hide there, and he would live there on the contents of large and small gas jars. The mysterious pursuit had been left far behind. You wouldn't catch him now, oh no. If only it were easier to breathe, and one could get rid of his pain in the temples, this numbing pain. The path twisted through the wood and came out into a transverse road, while farther on a river glinted in the darkness. He also saw a bridge and a dim pile of structures on the other side of it, and at first for one moment it seemed to him that over there against the dark sky was the familiar triangular roof of the manor with its black lightning conductor. But immediately he realized that this was some subtle ruse on the part of the chess gods, for the parapet of the bridge produced the rain glistening, trembling shapes of great female figures, and a queer reflection danced on the river. He walked along the bank, trying to find another bridge, the bridge where you sink up to your ankles in sawdust. He looked for a long time, and finally, quite out of the way, he found a narrow, quiet little bridge, and thought that here at least he could cross peacefully. But on the other bank everything was unfamiliar. Lights flashed past and shadows slid by. He knew the manor was somewhere here, close by, but he was approaching it from an unfamiliar angle, and how difficult everything was. His legs from hips to heels were tightly filled with lead, the way the base of a chessman is weighted. Gradually the lights disappeared, the phantoms grew sparser, and a wave of oppressive blackness washed over him. By the light of a last reflection he made out a front garden and a couple of brown bushes, and it seemed to him he recognized the miller's house. He stretched out a hand to the fence, but at this point triumphant pain began to overwhelm him, pressing down from above on his skull, and it was as if he were becoming flatter and flatter, and then he soundlessly dissipated. "9. The sidewalk skidded, reared up at right angle, and swayed back again. Gunther straightened himself up, breathing heavily, while his comrade, supporting him and also swaying, kept repeating, "Gunther, Gunther, try to walk." Gunther stood up quite straight, and after this brief stop, which was not the first, both of them continued farther along the deserted night street, which alternately rose up smoothly to the stars and then sloped down again. Gunther, a big sturdy fellow, had drunk more than his comrade, the latter Kurt by name, supported Gunther as best he could, although the beer was throbbing thunderously in his head. Where are, Gunther strove to ask. Where are the others? A moment before they had all been sitting around an oaken table, 30 fellows or so, happy, level-headed, hard-working men celebrating the 5th anniversary of their leaving school with a good sing and the sonorous ringing of clinked glasses, whereas now, as soon as they had started to disperse to their homes, they found themselves beset by nausea and darkness and the hopeless unsteadiness of this sidewalk. The others are there, said Kurt, with a broad gesture which unpleasantly called into life the nearest wall. It leaned forward and slowly straightened up again. They've gone, elucidated Kurt sadly. But Karl is in front of us, said Gunther slowly and distinctly, and a resilient, beery wind caused them both to sway to one side. They halted, took a step backwards, and again went their way. I'm telling you, Karl is there, repeated Gunther sulkily. And truly a man was sitting on the edge of the sidewalk with his head lowered. They miscalculated their impetus and were carried past. When they succeeded in approaching him, the man smacked his lips and slowly turned toward him. Yes, it was Karl, but what a Karl! His face blank, his eyes glazed. I'm just taking a rest, he said in a dull voice. I'll continue in a minute. Suddenly a taxi with its flag came up, rolling slowly over the deserted asphalt. Stop him, said Karl. I want him to take me. The car drew up. Gunther kept tumbling over Karl, trying to help him get up, and Kurt tugged at somebody's gray-spattered foot. From his seat, the driver encouraged all this good-naturedly, and then climbed out and also began to help. The limply floundering body was squeezed through the aperture of the door, and the car immediately pulled away. And we're nearly there, said Kurt. The figure standing next to him now sighed, and Kurt, looking at him, saw that it was Karl, which meant that the taxi had carried off Gunther instead. I'll give you a hand, he said guiltily. Let's go. Looking in front of him with empty, childlike eyes, Karl leaned toward him, and they both moved off and started to cross the other side of the heaving asphalt. Here's another, said Kurt. A fat man with a hat lay all hunched up on the sidewalk beside a garden fence. That's probably Pulvermacher, muttered Kurt. You know, he's changed an awful lot in the recent years. That's not Pulvermacher, replied Karl, sitting down on the sidewalk beside him. Pulvermacher is bald. It doesn't matter, said Kurt. He also has to be taken home. They tried to raise the man by his shoulders and lost their equilibrium. Don't break the fence, cautioned Karl. He has to be taken, repeated Kurt. Perhaps it's Pulvermacher's brother. He was there too. The man was evidently sound asleep. He was wearing a black overcoat with strips of velvet on the lapels. His fat face with its heavy chin and convex eyelids was glossy in the light of the street lamp. Let's wait for a taxi, said Kurt, and followed the example of Karl, who had squatted on the curbing. This night will come to an end, he said confidently, and added, looking at the sky, how they revolve. Stars, explained Karl, and both sat still, staring upward at the wonderful, pale, nebulous abyss where the stars floated in an arc. Pulvermacher's also looking, said Kurt after a silence. No, he's sleeping, objected Karl, glancing at the fat, motionless face. Sleeping, agreed Kurt. A light glided over the asphalt, and the same good-natured taxi that had taken Gunther away somewhere softly pulled in alongside the sidewalk. Another one? Laughed the driver. They could have gone together. But where? Karl asked Kurt sleepily. There must be an address of some kind. Let's look in his pockets. The latter answered vaguely. Swaying and involuntarily nodding, they bent over the motionless man, and the fact that his overcoat was unbuttoned facilitated their further exploration. Velvet waistcoat, said Kurt. Poor fellow, poor fellow. In the very first pocket they found a postcard folded in two, which parted in their hands, and one half of the receiver's address in it slipped down and vanished without trace. On the remaining half, however, they found another address that had been written across the card and thickly underlined. On the other side there was just a single level line, cut short at the left, but even if it had been possible to place it side by side with fallen off and lost half the meaning of this line would hardly have become any clearer. Back Barra Pum, read Kurt, mistaking the Russian letters for Latin ones, which was excusable. The address found on the postcard was told to the driver, and then they had to thrust the heavy, lifeless body into the car, and again the driver came to their aid. On the door, large chess squares, the blazon of Berlin taxis, showed in the light of the street lamp. Finally, the jam-packed motor car moved off. Karl fell asleep on the way. His body and the unknown's body and the body of Kurt, who was sitting on the floor, came into a soft involuntary contact at every turn, and subsequently Kurt finished up on the seat, and Karl and the most of the unknown fellow on the floor. When the car stopped and the driver opened the door, he was unable at first to make out how many people were inside. Carl woke up immediately, but the heartless man was motionless as before. "I'm curious to know what you'll do with your friend now," said the driver. "They're probably waiting for him," said Kurt. The driver, considering he had done his job and carried enough heavy weights for the night, raised his flag and announced the fare. "I'll pay," said Carl. "No, I will," said Kurt. "I found him first." This argument convinced Carl. The car was emptied with difficulty and departed. 3 people remained on the sidewalk, one of them lying with his head resting against a stone step. Swaying and sighing, Kurt and Carl moved to the middle of the street and then, addressing themselves to the sole lighted window in the house, shouted hoarsely, and immediately, with unexpected responsiveness, the light-slashed blind trembled and was pulled up. A young woman looked out of the window. Not knowing how to begin, Kurt smirked, then, pulling himself together, said boldly and loudly, "Miss, we've brought pulvermacher." The woman gave no answer, and the blind descended with a rattle. One could see, however, that she stayed by the window. "We found him in the street," said Carl uncertainly, and addressing the window. The blind went up again. "A velvet waistcoat," Kurt considered it necessary to explain. The window emptied, but a moment later the darkness behind the front door disintegrated, and through the glass appeared an illuminated staircase, marble as far as the first landing. And this newborn staircase had not had time to congeal completely before swift feminine legs appeared on the stairs. A key grated in the lock and the door opened. On the sidewalk with his back to the steps lay a stout man in black. Meanwhile, the staircase continued to spawn people. A gentleman appeared wearing bedroom slippers, black trousers, and a collarless starched shirt, and behind him came a pale, stocky maid with scuppers on her bare feet. Everybody bent over Luzhin, and the guiltily grinning, completely drunk strangers kept explaining something, while one of them insistently proffered half a postcard, like a visiting card. The 5 of them carried Luzhin up the stairs, and his fiancée, supporting the heavy, precious head, let out a cry when the light over the staircase suddenly went out. In the darkness everything swung. There was a knocking and a shuffling and a puffing, and someone took a step backwards and evoked God's name in German. And when the light came on again, one of the strangers, and sitting in the stair, and the other was being crushed by Luzhin's body, while higher up on the landing stood Mother in a gaudily embroidered robe, surveying with bright prominent eyes the lifeless body that her husband, groaning, muttering, was supporting, and the large awful head that lay on her daughter's shoulder. They carried Luzhin into the drawing-room. The young strangers clicked their heels, trying to introduce themselves to someone, and shied away from the little tables laden with porcelain. They were seen at once in all the rooms. No doubt they wanted to leave, but were unable to make it to the front hall. They were found on all the divans, in the bathroom, and on the trunk in the hallway, and there was no way of getting rid of them. Their number was unclear, a fluctuating, blurred number, but after a while they disappeared, and the maid said that she had let 2 of them out, and that the rest must still be sprawling around somewhere, and that drunkenness ruins a man, and that her sister's fiancé also drank. "Congratulations, he's pickled," said the mistress of the house, looking at Luzhin, who was lying like a corpse, half undressed and covered with a lap robe, on a couch in the drawing-room. "Congratulations. And strange thing, the fact that Luzhin was drunk pleased her, evoked a warm sentiment with regard to Luzhin. In such revelry she detected something human and natural, and even a certain daring, a breath of spirit. This was a situation in which people she knew found themselves good people, merry people, and why not, she reasoned, these troubled times knock one off balance, so no wonder our Russian lads turned to drink, the Green Dragon and Comforter, from time to time. But when it turned out there was no smell of vodka or wine coming from Luzhin, and he was sleeping queerly, not at all like a drunken man, she was disappointed and chided herself for being able to presuppose a single natural inclination in Luzhin. While the doctor, who came at dawn, was examining him, a change occurred in Luzhin's face. His eyelids lifted and dim eyes looked out from beneath them, and only then did his fiancée come out of that numbness of the soul that had possessed her ever since she saw the body lying on the front steps. It is true she had been expecting something terrible, but this precise horror had been beyond her imagination. Last night, when Luzhin had not visited them as usual, she had called the chess cafe and been told that the play had finished long ago. Then she called the hotel, and they replied that Luzhin had still not returned. She went out onto the street, thinking that perhaps Luzhin was waiting by the locked door, and then called the hotel again, and then consulted her father about notifying the police. "Nonsense," her father said decisively. "There must be plenty of friends of his around. The man's gone to a party." But she knew perfectly well that Luzhin had no friends, and that there was something senseless about his absence. And now, looking at Luzhin's large, pale face, She so brimmed with aching, tender pity that it seemed as if, without his pity inside her, there would be no life either. It was impossible to think of this inoffensive man, sprawling in the street and his soft body being handled by drunks. She could not bear to think that everybody had taken his mysterious swoon for the flabby, vulgar sleep of a reveler, and had expected a devil-may-care snore from his helpless quietude. Such pity, such pain, and this outmoded, eccentric waistcoat that one could not bear to look at without tears, and that poor curl in the bare white neck all creased like a child's, and all this had happened because of her. She had not kept an eye out on him. Had not kept an eye on him. She should have stayed by him the whole time, not allowed him to play too much. And how was it he had not been run over by a car yet? And why had she not guessed that at any minute he might topple over paralyzed by his chest fatigue? "Lucian," she said, smiling, as if he could see her smile. "Lucian, everything's all right. Lucian, do you hear me?" As soon as he was taken to the hospital, she went to the hotel for his things, and at first they would not let her into his room, and this led to long explanations and a telephone call to the hospital by a rather cheeky hotel employee, after which she had to pay Lucian's bill for the last week, and she did not have enough money, and more explanations were necessary, and it seemed to her that the mockery of Lucian was continuing, and it was difficult to hold back her tears. And when, refusing the coarse help of the hotel chambermaid, she began to gather up Lucian's things, the feeling of pity rose to an extreme pitch. Among his things were some that must have been carrying around with him for ages, not noticing them and never throwing them out. Unnecessary, unexpected things, a canvas belt with a metallic buckle in the shape of a letter S with a leather pocket on the side, a miniature penknife for a watch chain inlaid with mother of pearl, a collection of Italian postcards, all blue sky and Madonnas and lilac haze over Vesuvius, and unmistakably St. Petersburg things, a tiny abacus with red and white counters, a desk calendar with turned-back pages for completely non-calendar year 1918. All this was kicking about in a drawer among some clean but crumpled shirts whose colored stripes and starched cuffs evoked a picture of long-gone years. There also she found a collapsible opera hat bought in London, and in it the visiting card of somebody named Valentinov. The toilet articles were in such a state that she resolved to leave them behind, and to buy him a rubber sponge in place of that unbelievable loofah. A chess set, a cardboard box full of notes and diagrams, and a pile of chess magazines she wrapped up in a separate package. He did not need this now. When the valise and the small trunk were full and locked, she looked once more into all the corners and retrieved from under the bed a pair of astonishingly old, torn, laceless brown shoes that served Lucian in place of bedroom slippers. Carefully she pushed them back under the bed. From the hotel she went to the chess cafe, remembering that Lucian had been without his cane and hat, and thinking that perhaps he had left them there. There were lots of people in the tournament hall, and Torati, standing by the coat rack, was jauntily taking off his overcoat. She realized that she had come just as a play was about to be resumed, and that nobody knew of Lucian's illness. Never mind, she thought with a certain malicious satisfaction, let them wait. She found the cane, but there was no hat, and after glancing with hatred at the small table, where the pieces had already been set out, and the broad-shouldered Torati, who was rubbing his hands and deeply clearing his throat like a bass singer, she swiftly left the cafe, re-entered the taxi, in top of which Lucian's checked little trunk showed touchingly green, and returned to the sanatorium. She was not at home when yesterday's young men reappeared. They came to apologize for the tempestuous nocturnal intrusion. They were well dressed. They scraped and bowed and asked for the gentleman they had brought home the night before. They were thanked for delivering him, and were told for the sake of decorum that he had slept it off wonderfully in some friendly revels, at which his colleagues that honored him on the occasion of his betrothal. After sitting for 10 minutes, the young men rose and went away quite satisfied. At about the same time, a distracted little man having some connection with the organization of the tournament arrived at the sanatorium. He was not admitted to see Lucian. The composed young lady who spoke to him informed him coldly that Lucian had to resume his chess, had overtired himself, and it was uncertain when he would resume his chess activities. "That's awful, that's incredible," plaintively repeated the little man several times. "An unfinished game, and such a good game. Give the maestro my anxious wishes, my best wishes." He waved a hand hopelessly, plodded to the exit, shaking his head, and the newspapers printed an announcement that Lucian had had a nervous breakdown before finishing the deciding game, and that, according to Torati, Black was bound to lose because of the weakness of the pawn on F4. And in all the chess clubs the experts made long studies of the positions of the pieces, pursued possible continuations, and noted White's weakness at D3, but nobody could find the key to the indisputable victory. One night soon after this, there took place a long brewing, long rumbling, and at last breaking, futile, disgracefully loud but unavoidable scene. She had just returned from the sanatorium and was hungrily eating hot buckwheat cereal, and relating to Luzhin was better. Her parents exchanged looks, and then it began. "I hope," said her mother resonantly, "that you have renounced your crazy intention." "More, please," she asked, holding out her plate. "Out of a certain feeling of delicacy," continued her mother, and here her father quickly took up the torch. "Yes," he said, "out of delicacy. Your mother has said nothing to you these past days until your friend's situation cleared up. But now you must listen to us. You yourself know that our main desire and care and aim and general desire is for you to be all right, for you to be happy, etc. But for this, in my time, parents would simply have forbidden it," put in her mother. "That's all." No, what's forbidding got to do with this? You listen to me, my pet. You're not 18 years old, but 25, and I can see nothing whatsoever enticing or poetic in all that has happened." "She just likes to annoy us," interrupted her mother again. "It's just one continuous nightmare." "What exactly are you talking about?" asked the daughter, finally, and smiling from beneath lowered brows, resting her elbows softly on the table, and looking from her father to her mother. "About the fact that it's time you ceased to be silly," cried her mother. "About the fact that marriage to a penniless crackpot is nonsense." "Ach!" uttered the daughter, and stretching her arm out on the table, she put her head up on it. "Here's what," her father began. "We suggest you go to the Italian lakes. Go with Mama to the Italian lakes. You can't imagine what heavenly spots there are. I remember the first time I saw Isola Bella." Her shoulders began to twitch from half-suppressed laughter. Then she lifted her head and continued to laugh softly, keeping her eyes closed. "What is it you want?" asked her mother, and banged on the table. "First," she replied, "that you stop shouting. Second, that Luzhin gets completely well." "Isola Bella means beautiful island," continued her father hastily, trying with a meaningful grimace to intimate to his wife that he alone would manage it. "You can't imagine an azure sky, and the heat, and magnolias, and the superb hotels at Stresa, and of course tennis, dancing, and I particularly remember, what do you call them, those insects that light up?" "Well, and what then?" asked the mother with rapacious curiosity. "What then, when your friend, if he doesn't die?" "That depends on him," said the daughter, trying to speak calmly. "I can't abandon him, and I won't, period. You'll be in the madhouse with him, that's where you'll be, my girl." "Mad or not," began the daughter with a trembling smile. Doesn't Italy tempt you?" cried her father. "The girl is crazy. You won't marry this chess moron." "Moron yourself. If I want, I'll marry him." "You're a narrow-minded and wicked woman." Now, that's enough, mumbled her father. "I won't let him set foot in here again," panted her mother. "That's final." The daughter began to cry soundlessly and left the dining room, banging into a corner of the sideboard as she passed, and letting out a plaintive "D-it" that offended sideboard went on vibrating for a long time. "That was a little too harsh," said the father in a whisper. "I'm not defending her, of course, but all kinds of things happen. The man overtired himself, had a breakdown. Perhaps after this shock he'll really change for the better. Look, I think I'll go to see what she's doing." And the following day he had a long conversation with the famous psychiatrist whose sanatorium Luzhin was staying. The psychiatrist had a black Assyrian beard with moist, tender eyes that shimmered marvelously as he listened to his interlocutor. He said that Luzhin was not an epileptic and was not suffering from progressive paralysis, and that his condition was the consequence of prolonged strain, and that as soon as it was possible to have a sensible conversation with Luzhin, one would have to impress upon him that a blind passion for chess was fatal for him, and that for a long time he would have to renounce his profession and lead an absolutely normal mode of life. "And can such a man marry?" "Why not, if he's not impotent?" The professor smiled tenderly. "Moreover, there's an advantage for him in being married. Our patient needs care, attention, and diversion. This is a temporary clouding of the senses, which is now gradually passing. As far as we can judge, A complete recovery is underway. The psychiatrist's words produced a small sensation at home. That means Chess is kaput, noted the mother with satisfaction. What will be left of him, then? Pure madness? No, no, said the father. There's no question of madness. The man will be healthy. The devil's not as black as his painters. I said painters, did you hear, my pet? But the daughter did not smile and only sighed. To tell the truth, she felt very tired. She spent the larger part of the day at the sanatorium, and there was something unbelievably exhausting in the exaggerated whiteness of everything surrounding her, and in the noiseless white movements of the nurses. Still extremely pale, with a growth of bristle, and wearing a clean shirt, Luzhin lay immobile. There were moments, it is true, when he raised one knee out of the sheet, or gently moved an arm, and changing shadows would flit over his face, and sometimes an almost rational light would appear in his eyes. But none the less, all that could be said of him was that he was immobile, a distressing immobility, exhausting for the gaze that sought a hint of conscious life in it, and it was impossible to tear one's gaze away, or so wanted to penetrate behind this yellowish forehead, wrinkling from time to time with a mysterious inner movement, to pierce the mysterious fog that stirred with difficulty, endeavoring perhaps to disentangle itself, to condense into separate human thoughts. Yes, there was movement, there was. The formless fog thirsted for contours, for embodiments, and once something, a mirror-like glint, appeared in the darkness, and in this dim ray, Luzhin perceived a face with a black, curly beard, a familiar image, an inhabitant of childish nightmares. The face in the dim little mirror came closer, and immediately the clear space clouded over, and there was foggy darkness and slowly dispersing horror, and upon the experia of many dark centuries a single earthly night. The light again came into being, and suddenly something burst radiantly. The darkness parted and remained only in the form of a fading shadowy frame, in the midst of which was a shining blue window. Tiny yellow leaves gleamed in this blueness, throwing a speckled shadow on a white tree trunk that was concealed lower down by the dark green paw of a fir tree, and immediately this vision filled with life. The leaves began to quiver, spots crept over the trunk, and the green paw oscillated, and Luzhin, unable to support it, closed his eyes with a bright oscillation and remained beneath his lids. I once buried something under those trees, he thought blissfully, and he seemed on the point of recalling exactly what it was when he heard a rustle above him in two calm voices. He began to listen, trying to understand where he was, and why something soft and cold was lying on his forehead. After a while he opened his eyes again. A fat woman in white was holding her palm on his forehead, and there in the window was the same happy radiance. He wondered what to say, and catching sight of a little watch pinned on his breast, he licked his lips and asked what time it was. Movement immediately began around him. Women whispered, and Luzhin remarked with astonishment that he understood their language, could even speak it himself. "Vispat ist es? What time is it?" he repeated. 9 in the morning, said the women. "How do you feel?" In the window, if you lifted yourself a little, you could see a fence that was also spotted with shadow. "Evidently I got home," said Luzhin pensively, and again lowered his light, empty head onto the pillow. For a while he heard whispers, the light tinkle on glass. There was something pleasant about the absurdity of everything that was happening, and it was amazingly good to lie there without moving. Thus he imperceptibly fell asleep, and when he awoke, he saw again the blue gleam of Russian autumn. But something had changed. Someone unfamiliar had appeared next to his bed. Luzhin turned his head. On a chair to the right sat a man in white, with a black beard, looking at him attentively with smiling eyes. Luzhin thought vaguely that he resembled the peasant from the mill, but the resemblance immediately vanished when the man spoke. "Karashno?" he inquired amiably. "Who are you?" asked Luzhin in German. "A friend," replied the gentleman, "a faithful friend. You have been sick, but now you are well. Do you hear? You are well." Luzhin began to meditate on these words, but the man did not allow him to finish and said sympathetically, "You must lie quiet, rest, get lots of sleep." Thus Luzhin came back from a long journey, having lost en route the greater part of his luggage, and it was too much bother to restore what was lost. These first days of recovery were quiet and smooth. Women in white gave him tasty food to eat. The bewitching bearded man came and said nice things to him, and looked at him with his agate gaze, which bathed one's body in warmth. Shortly, Luzhin began to notice that there was someone else in the room, a palpitating, elusive presence. Once when he woke up, someone noiselessly and hastily went away, and once when he was half dozed, someone's extremely light and apparently familiar whisper started beside him and immediately stopped, and hints began to flicker in the bearded man's conversation about something mysterious and happy. It was in the air around him and in the autumn beauty of the window, and it trembled somewhere behind the tree in enigmatic, evasive happiness, and Luzhin gradually began to realize the heavenly void in which his transparent thoughts floated was being filled in from all sides. Warned of the imminence of a wonderful event, he looked through the railed head of his bed at the white door and waited for it to open, and the prediction to come true, but the door did not open. Suddenly to one side, beyond his field of vision, something stirred. Under the cover of a large screen, someone was standing and laughing. I'm coming, just a moment," muttered Luzhin, freeing his legs from the sheet and looking with bulging eyes under the chair beside the bed for something to put on his feet. "You're not going anywhere," said a voice, and a pink dress instantaneously filled the void. The fact that his life was illumined first of all from his side eased his return. For a short while longer those harsh eminences, the god of his being, remained in shadow. A tender optical illusion took place. He returned to life from a direction other than the one he had left it in, and the work of redistributing his recollections was assumed by the wondrous happiness that welcomed him first. And when finally this area of his life had been fully restored, and suddenly, with the roar of a crumbling wall, Taradi appeared, together with the tournament and all its preceding tournaments, this happiness was able to remove Taradi's protesting image and replace the twitching chessmen in their box. As soon as they came to life, the lid was slammed upon them, and the struggle did not continue for long. The doctor assisted, the precious stones of his eyes coruscating and melting. He spoke of the fact that all around them was a bright, free world, and that chess was a cold amusement that dries up and corrupts the brain, and that the passionate chess player is just as ridiculous as the madman inventing a perpetuum mobile, or counting pebbles on a deserted ocean shore. "I shall stop loving you," said his fiancée, if you start thinking about chess, and I can see every thought, so behave yourself." "Horror, suffering, despair," said the doctor quietly, "those are what this exhausting game gives rise to." And he proved to Luzhin that Luzhin himself was well aware of this, that Luzhin was unable to think of chess without a feeling of revulsion, as in some mysterious fashion Luzhin, melting and coruscating, and blissfully relaxing, agreed with his reasoning. And into the vast, fragrant garden of the sanatorium, Luzhin went strolling in new bedroom slippers made of soft leather, and registered his approval of the dahlias, while beside him walked his fiancée and thought for some reason of a book that she had read in childhood, in which all the difficulties of life of a schoolboy who had run away from home together with a dog he had saved were resolved by a convenient for the author fever, not typhus, not scarlet fever, but just a fever, and the young stepmother, whom he had not loved hitherto, so cared for him that he suddenly began to appreciate her and called her Mamma, and a warm tearlet would roll down her face and everything was fine. "Luzhin is well," she said with a smile, looking at his ponderous profile, the profile of Vladimir Napoleon, as it bent apprehensively over a flower, which maybe might bite. "Luzhin is well. Luzhin is out for a walk. Luzhin is very sweet." "It doesn't smell," said Luzhin in a thick, small voice. "Nor should it smell," she replied, taking him by the arms. "Dahlias aren't supposed to, but see that white flower over there? That's Mr. Tabacum, and he has a strong smell at night. When I was little, I always used to suck the sap out of the corolla. Now I don't like it any more. In our garden in Russia," began Luzhin, and became thoughtful, squinting at the flower beds. "We had these flowers over here," he said. "Our garden was quite a presentable one." "Asters," she explained. "I don't like them, they're coarse. Now, in our garden, in general, there was a lot of talk about childhood." The professor talked about it too, and questioned Luzhin. "Your father owned land, didn't he?" Luzhin nodded. "Land, the country, that's excellent," continued the professor. "You probably had horses and cows?" A nod. "Let me imagine your house, ancient trees all around your house, large and bright. Your father returns from the hunt." Luzhin recalled that his father had once found a fat, nasty little fledgling in a ditch. "Yes," replied Luzhin uncertainly. "Some details," asked the professor softly. "Please, I beg you, I'm interested in the way you occupied yourself in childhood, what you played with. You had some tin soldiers, I'm sure." But Luzhin rarely grew enlivened during these conversations. On the other hand, constantly nudged by such interrogations, his thoughts would return again and again to the sphere of his childhood. It was impossible to express his recollections in words. There simply were no grown-up words for his childish impressions, and if he ever related anything, then it did so jerkily and unwillingly, rapidly sketching the outlines and marking a complex move, rich in possibilities with just a letter and a number. His preschool, pre-chess childhood, which he had never thought about before, dismissing it with a slight shudder so as not to find dormant horrors and humiliating insults there, proved now to be an amazingly safe spot, where he could take pleasant excursions that sometimes brought a piercing pleasure. Luzhin himself was unable to understand whence the excitement, why the image of the fat French governess with the 3 bone buttons on one side of her skirt that drew together whenever she lowered her enormous croup into an armchair, why the image that had so then irritated him now evoked in his breast a feeling of tender constriction. He recalled in their St. Petersburg house, her asthmatic obesity had preferred to this staircase the old-fashioned water-powered elevator which the janitor used to set in motion by means of a lever in the vestibule. "Here we go," said the janitor, and said invariably as he closed the door and leaves behind her, and the heavy, puffing, shouldering elevator would creep slowly upwards on its thick velvet cable, and past it down the peeling wall that was visible through the glass would come dark geographic patches, those patches of dampness and age among which, as among the clouds in the sky, the reigning fashion is for silhouettes of Australia and the Black Sea. Sometimes little Luzhin would go up with her, but more often he stayed below and listened to the elevator high up and behind the wall, struggling upwards, as he always hoped, did little Luzhin, that it would get stuck halfway. Often enough this happened. The noise would cease, and from unknown intermural space would come a wail for help. The janitor below would move the lever with a grunt of effort, then open the door into blackness and ask briskly, looking upwards, "Moving?" Finally something would shudder and stir. After a little while the elevator would descend, now empty. Empty. Goodness knows what happened to her. Perhaps she had traveled up to heaven and remained there with her asthma, her licorice candies, and her pince-nez on a black cord. The recollection also came back empty, and for the first time in all his life, perhaps, Luzhin asked himself the question, where exactly had it all gone? What had become of his childhood? Whither in the veranda floated, with the rustling of the bushes, had the familiar paths crept away? With an involuntary movement of the soul, he looked for these paths in the sanatorium garden, but the flower beds had a different outline, the birches were placed differently, and the gaps in their russet foliage filled with autumn blue, and in no way corresponded to the remembered gaps into which he tried to fit these cut-out pieces of azure. It seemed as though that distant world was unrepeatable. Through it roamed by now completely bearable images of his parents, softened by the haze of time, and the clockwork train with its tin car painted to look like paneling went buzzing under the flounces of the armchair, and goodness knows how this affected the dummy engine driver, too big for the locomotive and hence placed in the tender. That was the childhood Luzhin now visited willingly in his thoughts. It was followed by another period, a long chess period that both the doctor and his fiancée called lost years, a dark period of spiritual blindness, a dangerous delusion, lost years. They did not bear recollection. Lurking there like an evil spirit was the somehow terrible image of Valentinov. "All right, we agree, that will do. Lost years, away with them, they are forgotten, crossed out of life, and once they are thus excluded, the light of childhood merged directly with the present light, and its flow formed the image of his fiancée. Her being expressed all the gentleness and charm that could be extracted from his recollections of childhood, as if the dapples of light scattered over the footpaths of the manor garden had now grown together into a single warm radiance. Feeling happy?" asked her mother dejectedly, looking at her animated face. "Shall we soon be celebrating a wedding?" "Soon," she replied, and threw her small round gray hat on the couch. "In any case, he's leaving the sanatorium in a day or two. It's costing your father a pretty penny, about 1,000 marks. I've just scoured through all the bookstores," sighed the daughter. "He absolutely had to have Jules Verne and Sherlock Holmes, and it turns out he's never read Tolstoy. Naturally, he's a peasant," muttered her mother. "I always said so. Listen, Mamma," she said, lightly tapping her glove against the package of books. "Let's make an agreement. From today on, let's have no more of these cracks. It is stupid, degrading of you, and above all, completely pointless. Then don't marry him," said the mother, fair face working. "Don't marry him, I beseech you. Why, if you like, I'll throw myself on my knees before you," and leaning on one elbow on the armchair, she stared with difficulty to bend her leg, slowly lowering her large, slightly creaking body. "You'll cave the floor in," said her daughter, and picking up the books went out of the room. Luzhin read Fogg's Journey and the Holmes memoirs in 2 days, and when he had read them, he said they were not what he wanted. This was an incomplete edition. On the other books, he liked Anna Karenine, particularly the pages on Zemstvo elections and the dinner ordered by Oblonsky. Dead Souls also made a certain impression on him. Moreover, in one place, he unexpectedly recognized a whole section that he had once taken down in childhood as a long and painful dictation. Besides the so-called classics, his fiancée brought him all sorts of frivolous French novels. Everything that could divert Lucien was good, even these doubtful stories which he read, though embarrassed, with interest. Poetry, on the other hand. For instance, a small volume of Reich's that she had brought on a recommendation of a salesman threw him into a state of severe perplexity and sorrow. Correspondingly, the professor forbade Luzhin to be given anything by Dostoevsky, who, in the professor's words, had an oppressive effect on the psyche of contemporary man, for as in a terrible mirror. "Oh, Mr. Luzhin doesn't brood over books," she said cheerfully, "and he understands poetry badly because of the rhymes. The rhymes put him off. And strangely enough, in spite of the fact that Luzhin had read still fewer books in his life than she in hers, had ever finished high school, and had been interested in nothing but chess, she felt in him the ghost of a culture that she herself lacked. There were titles of books and names of characters which for some reason were household words to Luzhin, although the books themselves he had never read. His speech was clumsy and full of shapeless, ridiculous words, but in it there was sometimes quivered a mysterious intonation hinting at some other kind of words, which were living and charged with subtle meaning, but which he could not utter. Despite his ignorance, despite the meagerness of his vocabulary, Luzhin harbored within him a barely perceptible vibration, the shadow of sounds that he had once heard. No more did her mother speak of his uncouthness or of his other defects after that day when, remaining like a genuflectory position, she had sobbed out everything to her heart's content, her cheek pressed to the arm of the chair. "I would have understood everything," she said later to her husband, "understood and forgiven everything if only she really loved him. But that's the dreadful part." "No, I don't quite agree with you," interrupted her husband. "I also thought at first that it was all mental, but her attitude to his illness convinces me to the contrary. Of course such a union is dangerous, and she could also have made a better choice. Although he's from an old, noble family, his narrow profession has left a certain mark on him. Remember Irina, who became an actress? Remember how she had changed when she came to us afterwards? All the same, disregarding all these defects, I consider him a good man. You'll see, he'll take up some useful occupation now. I don't know about you, but I simply can't bring myself to dissuade her any longer. In my opinion, we should brace ourselves and accept the inevitable." He spoke briskly and at length, holding himself very straight and playing with the lid of his cigarette case. "I feel just one thing," repeated his wife. "She doesn't love him."